Okay, continuing. In my humble opinion, one of the most astounding things about Christianity is that so many of its adherents, not all, but many, don't seem to recognize the inconsistencies among the Gospels. Getting back to the first bit, Together for Peace is quite right about the early church putting Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John into the canon despite the inconsistencies among them. I would simply note in response that the early church leaders did this not as historians, but as leaders of the church. The inclusion of these texts in the canon tells us nothing about their value as historical evidence for the events they describe. Fifth point, when inconsistencies accumulate. In his response, Together for Peace says, he doesn't see how I can get from noting the inconsistencies among the resurrection accounts in the four Gospels to my conclusion that these accounts cannot be used as historical evidence. Together for Peace makes much of the fact that the four resurrection accounts are consistent in as much as each says Jesus was raised from the dead. Of course, Together for Peace is correct about this. The four resurrection accounts are consistent in claiming that Jesus was raised from the dead. However, that's pretty much where the consistency ends. Why do I believe that makes the Gospels' resurrection accounts all but useless as evidence that Jesus was in fact raised from the dead? Well, an accumulation of inconsistencies reduces the probability that a story is true. At the very least, it negatively impacts the story's credibility. I mentioned this in a text comment under Together for Peace's video response already, but it bears repeating here. I'm a lawyer by training, and from time to time, as part of the administrative part of my job, I'm called upon to represent my employer in certain formal proceedings that can result in an employee losing his or her job for engaging in an act or acts of misconduct. When I do this, I have to prepare witnesses to testify at these proceedings. When I interview potential witnesses, I listen very carefully to what they say, and I compare what each witness says to what the other witnesses have said. If inconsistencies start to emerge among the witnesses' accounts, I've got a problem on my hands. If there are enough inconsistencies, I'm not going to be able to make my case. Many Christians have gotten it into their head that inconsistencies somehow make a story more credible. It's interesting because they kind of walk down both sides of the street on this, right? On one side, they say, well, the Gospels are not inconsistent. They don't disagree with one another. And on the other side, they say, but inconsistencies make a story more believable. Anyway, let me assure you, from my experience of working with witnesses in formal proceedings, inconsistencies have precisely the opposite effect. They make a story less credible. And there's an inverse relationship between the number and significance of inconsistencies and the credibility of a story. So, if I've got four witnesses to an act of misconduct, all four say the same act of misconduct occurred, they're completely consistent on that. But the first witness says it happened on the 10th floor, and the second says it happened in the basement, and the third says it happened in a different building than the first two identified, and the fourth witness says it happened out in the street. These differences are not making the claim that an act of misconduct occurred more credible. They're having precisely the opposite effect. And if I presented a case filled with these inconsistencies, no hearing officer in his or her right mind would say, well, these stories contradict one another, but I still find the act of misconduct occurred. That's just crazy! So when I look at the Gospel's resurrection narratives and see inconsistency piled upon inconsistency, and so on, it says to me something's not right. Add to this the fact that these inconsistency-riddled accounts purport to set forth details pertaining to the fulcrum, most extraordinary event in human history, and that the accounts are purported to have been inspired by the omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, divine sovereign of the universe, and I'm compelled to say they can't be true. All at once, there's just too much and not enough there to regard them as true. And if they're not true, they're useless as historical evidence of the events they purport to describe. Finally, at the risk of seeming to appeal to authority, I've discussed this stuff with colleagues and friends who are professional historians, people noted in their field, several of whom are Christians. To a person, they've told me that they do not regard the resurrection accounts in the Gospels as historical evidence. Sixth point, whether the Christian scriptures can be used as evidence of anything as regards Jesus' resurrection. In his response, Together for Peace says that we can use the New Testament texts as evidence that the disciples and others believed that Jesus was raised from the dead. I agree, but that doesn't really get us anywhere, does it? I mean, we can use other mythological texts as evidence that people believed in Zeus, Hera, Athena, Hermes, and the rest. I can use other mythological texts as evidence that people believed that the goddess Athena appeared to a guy named Bellerophon to tell him where he could find Pegasus. The fact that people believed these things is no more in dispute than the fact that the disciples and others believed that Jesus was raised from the dead. Seventh point, the charge of excessive, unwarranted skepticism. In his response, Together for Peace opines that I take a, quote, excessive, unwarranted, skeptical stance, unquote, vis-a-vis the gospel resurrection narratives. I suppose I could call Together for Peace's stance astoundingly credulous, but that sort of thing is unlikely to advance any sort of discussion. Look, I've laid out my reasons for being skeptical here. We have an extraordinary claim, namely that Jesus rose from the dead, or was raised from the dead. In light of that, and the reasons I've given for my skepticism, it seems clear to me that skepticism is neither excessive nor unwarranted. Eighth point, focus on one historical criterion. In his response, Together for Peace complains that my video concentrated on only one of the criteria historians use to determine what constitutes historical evidence, namely the bit about sources that corroborate one another. Indeed, I did concentrate on that criterion. Why? Well, I was responding to the claim in Together for Peace's earlier video about whether there's any reason to believe that the New Testament texts are fabrications vis-a-vis Jesus' resurrection. It seems to me that when one has a bunch of texts that don't corroborate one another, one has reason to believe that something's been fabricated. And this takes me back to the first point in this video. Paul's claims in Galatians contradict the account of the very same events in the Acts of the Apostles. It seems to me that gives one reason to conclude that something has been fabricated. And I ask Together for Peace again, whom do we believe here? Paul in Galatians or the author of Acts? At least one of them has gotten it wrong. Ninth point and final. In his response, Together for Peace says, quote, it is clear that we differ. Indeed, we do. But as I've shown here, mine is the far stronger case. Thanks a lot.